What's up, T&B Youth Group? I hope you're having a great Sunday so far. I want to invite you to be a part of our youth Zoom hangout tonight at 7:30 that we do every Sunday night. I will be sending out a link later today so that you can be a part of that. Well, in my house, sometimes there is a little bit of a power struggle. Most of you know I have two children. I have a 5-year-old daughter named Kenna, and I have a 2-year-old son named Dean. And sometimes Kenna and Dean can act or speak in a way where it seems like they've forgotten who is the parent and who is the child. That sometimes they operate in a way where they think they are the ones in charge or they are the ones in control. And sometimes we have to have a hard conversation. Sometimes we have to say, well, Kenna, do you know who really is in charge in our family? And she would say, Mommy or Daddy. Well, maybe you can relate to that. Maybe sometimes there's a little bit of a power struggle in your house or in your life. I don't know how you feel about the authority figures in your life, your parents and teachers and others who are in authority. Maybe you don't like all the rules that they've placed on you, or maybe sometimes you feel like they treat you unfairly, or maybe you just don't like the way that they exercise their authority at times. But recognizing who truly has authority in your life and learning how to live under that authority is actually a pretty important part of life. If you just continue to live at odds with those in authority and just kind of continue to butt heads with them, you realize it makes life kind of difficult. But if you can live at peace with those in authority and you can respect the position that they are in, it actually seems like it makes life better for you. Well, we're going to continue the series we've been going through on Sunday mornings called Character. And we've been looking at the story of the Old Testament and several of the major characters that God uses as a part of that story. And as we look at their stories, we look at what their story reveals about the character of God. Well, a few weeks ago, we started talking about the very first king of God's people, of the Israelites. And his name was Saul. And we saw from Saul's story that he really struggled to listen to God. That Saul started to do some things his way rather than trusting in God's way. And because of that, God said he was going to take the kingdom away from Saul and he was going to give it to another. And so God has his prophet Samuel go and anoint a new king. And this king's name is David. And when he's anointed, he's a young boy. And it's going to be actually several years before he takes over as king. And Saul is unaware that this next king has been anointed. But we're going to see, so Saul is still king, but even before David ever becomes king, we're going to start to see some differences between David and Saul. There's kind of a contrast between these two characters. And one of the stories that I think really illustrates this contrast or these differences between the two is one of the most famous stories about David, and that's the story of David and Goliath. So we're going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 17 as we look at this well-known story of David and Goliath. So David is sent by his father to go and bring food to his older brothers who are fighting for Israel's army, and they're fighting against their enemy, the Philistines. And so David is maybe a teenager at this point. He's still a boy. He was tending to the sheep of his father, but his father goes and sends him to bring food to his brothers who are fighting in the army. And when he gets there, he realizes that the Philistines have sent out this champion warrior of theirs named Goliath. And Goliath is described as this giant of a man, this fierce warrior. And he challenges the Israelites to send out their best man to come and fight him. And if their best man could beat Goliath, then they said the Philistines would surrender to the Israelites. But no one wanted to face Goliath. Everyone was terrified of him, and no one would step up and say, I'll be the one to go and fight against him. And then David gets there. Once he hears about this challenge from Goliath, he goes to King Saul, and he volunteers to go and fight him. And here's the discussion between Saul and David in 1 Samuel 17, verses 32 through 37. David said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." Saul replied, "You are not able to go out against this Philistine to fight him. You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." So David volunteers to fight, but Saul says, you're just a young man. You can't take on this warrior. But David is confident, and he says, "I've seen God give me victory before in the past, that he helped me rescue sheep from the mouth of a lion and the mouth of a bear, and I know that he will allow me to defeat this Philistine." So already right here, you start to see a difference between Saul and David. That Saul, he's fearful, that he doesn't believe that God could give them victory over Goliath. Saul is certainly not volunteering himself to go and be that warrior to face him. But David trusts in God, that he believes that God is going to be with his people and that he's going to give them victory. And David volunteers boldly to go and face this warrior. So you start to see these differences between David and Saul. David goes into battle against Goliath, and he has this awesome speech that he gives to Goliath. Goliath kind of looks at him and taunts him and says, "Who is this that they've sent out to me?" Thinking that David is not much of an opponent, that he could take him really easily. But David has this awesome speech that he yells out to Goliath. And it's kind of almost like this Braveheart moment, like this William Wallace giving this great speech. So let's listen to what David has to say. This is in 1 Samuel 17, verses 45 through 47. David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." So again, you just see David's boldness and courage, and it comes from knowing that God is with them. He believes that God is powerful and he is mighty to save. And he says this loudly and boastfully to Goliath, saying, "God is going to help me defeat you." So again, you see David trusts in God, even though the king, Saul, was one who struggled to trust in God. If you know the rest of the story, David takes a slingshot and he's able to defeat this giant because of God's strength, because of God's help. And then the Israelites are able to defeat their enemies, the Philistines. Well, as you go on from here in the story, you just continue to see a contrast between Saul and David. That Saul, as David grows in popularity, people start to sing his praises. And Saul becomes very jealous of David, and he wants that praise. He's very concerned with praise from men. Whereas David, we see him continue to stay humble, and he is more concerned with pleasing God. He's described as this man after God's own heart. So you see this jealousy and this anger build from Saul, but you see humility from David. And then you see Saul even turn against David, even though David didn't deserve it. And Saul starts to have this hatred and anger, and he even tries to kill David. And then David has a couple different moments where he could have killed Saul, but he spares his life. That we see David as merciful. So you just continue to see this growing contrast between Saul, who doesn't really trust God, doesn't follow God's ways, and David, who does trust God and does follow in his ways. Well, later, David eventually does become king, and Saul passes away in battle. And so David takes over as king of Israel, and he wants to do something for God. That he plans to build a house for God where they could keep the Ark of the Covenant, where God's presence could dwell. Because up until this point, he lived in the tabernacle, a tent, and so David wanted to build a permanent house for God. But God speaks to David through the prophet Nathan, and he tells him, I don't need you to build me a house. But rather, God says, I am going to build you a house, that I'm going to make your house last forever. That he makes this awesome promise to David that his kingdom will endure forever, that his house will stay on the throne forever. And ultimately, we know that that is fulfilled in Jesus. That Jesus comes from the line of David, and he ends up being this king much greater than David, and his throne is one that's going to last forever. But when David hears this promise from God, he has this really awesome response, and we see it in 2 Samuel, chapter 7, verses 18 through 22. Then King David went in and sat before the Lord, and he said, Who am I, sovereign Lord, and what is my family, that you have brought me this far? And as if this were not enough in your sight, sovereign Lord, you have also spoken about the future of the house of your servant. And this decree, sovereign Lord, is for a mere human. What more can David say to you? For you know your servant, sovereign Lord. For the sake of your word and according to your will, you have done this great thing and made it known to your servant. How great you are, sovereign Lord. There is no one like you, and there is no God but you, as we have heard with our own ears. So David, as he replies to God and responds to this amazing promise that God has given him, we see that David worships God and praises him, and he recognizes his sovereignty, his authority, and he recognizes his faithfulness. I really think that is the difference between David and Saul. The David, we know him as described as this man after God's own heart. I think the reason he is a man after God's own heart is he recognizes that God is the one who is truly king, that David is just his servant. And we see that here in his prayer, that he says, God, you are the one who is in control. You are sovereign, and I want to submit to your plan and your authority. I think there is something that we can learn here from David. I think we can look at him and think about how do we in our lives recognize the kingship of God and submit to his kingdom. And I think what that looks like in our lives is it's not trying to gain more control for ourselves, but it's allowing God to be in control. It's not about building ourselves up and bringing glory to us, but it's about bringing glory to God in our lives. It's rather than living with me at the center of my life, it's living with God at the center of my life. So we live in a way where we let every part of our lives, the choices we make, our conversations, our relationships, we try to submit them to God's plans and what he wants for us. That we recognize his kingship and his authority. I think we can learn that from the story of David. You guys have a great week. I will see you later. Bye.